Today, we have two presenters. So we have Michelle Davis here with us. Michelle is a licensed clinical social worker in private practice serving North and South Carolina via telehealth and in person. She specializes in adult ADHD and grief and loss, having over a decade of professional experience with these areas as well as lived experience. And we have Stephanie, who is one of my coworkers here at Holistic Child and Family. Stephanie is an associate clinical social worker at Holistic Child and Family Practice. She specializes in neurodiversity affirming care and CPTSD. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stephanie and Michelle. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm gonna share my screen, which means I'm not gonna see the chat with my setup. So Ellie may catch some stuff or we'll save some time at the end. Alrighty.
All right, so I'm Michelle and my pronouns are she, her. We wanted to come and talk with you all about this topic today, grief and neurodivergence, because there's a lot of cultural misconceptions about grief, and I think even less awareness of how neurodivergent individuals might present when grieving. And of course, we're in this time of the year where there's a lot of celebrations being held. Dia de los Muertos, Christmas, Kwanzaa, Diwali, Hanukkah, Thanksgiving, just a couple, lots and lots of celebrations. And so even though we know that grief is present year round, this time of year can be particularly hard for folks, not just because of the celebrations, but also with the weather change and the, daylight savings and all that. It seems to be just kind of a hard time of year for grief. So today we want to explore that grief experience and specifically the grief experience from a neurodivergent lens. So as Ellie mentioned, one focus of my private practice is grief, and I first became clinically interested in grief when I was working as a bereavement counselor for hospice. But I have a lot of personal experience with grief as well that goes back to my teens. And I have ADHD, so my own grief has been from a neurodivergent lens. But a big passion of mine with grief is normalizing the experience because we are so averse to discussing death and loss in our culture.
Yeah, and so I met Michelle through Brain Spotting. We were both looking for neurodivergent practice partners, and I think we've been kind of like brain buddies ever since. So my interest in grief came from, as Ellie said, I work with neurodivergence and through sort of a disability justice lens, started kind of looking at like critical illness and life-limiting illness, and really started kind of thinking about kind of the stigma and kind of taboo around talking about death and dying and the grieving process. So that's been kind of an interest of mine since, and also as another neurodivergent person.
So to start out, we would like for you all to take a few moments to just reflect back silently on your own past grief experiences and just kind of think a little bit about what were the ways in which your grief manifested itself on an internal level and also on an outward level, things that other people may have been able to observe. And how did those people respond to you when you were grieving, both in that short term, right when the loss is fresh, and also over the long term, getting support over the long term? Think a little bit about how did you express your needs to them? And if you're neurodivergent, do you feel like that part of your identity had any impact on your grief? And if so, how? At the end of the presentation, if we have some time, we'll give an opportunity to share for anybody that would like to.
So we're just gonna pause a minute here to let you think about that.
So first thing that we want to do is take a look at what some of the common symptoms of grief are. There's a lot of symptoms that commonly show up during grief of people across all neurotypes. And not everybody is going to experience all of these symptoms that you see here, and also ones that aren't listed can show up. But these are just some that we see frequently. So one thing I want to point out is that I think a lot of people, before they've experienced it, don't realize that grief has a real physical component to it. So we as clinicians know that body sensations and emotions, can go really hand in hand, but we can dismiss those physical sensations sometimes as being caused by other things, medical causes, when in fact they might be related to the strong emotions of grief. So it's important when you're working with clients to help them identify not just how they feel emotionally, but also how it's showing up in the body. And of course, you think about it can be a challenge if folks are already experiencing alexithymia, or on the other end of that, if there's discomfort due to hyper-awareness of the body and sensory overload. In addition to emotional and physical, there's also a lot of mental and spiritual effects of grief. Under the mental category there, you can see that some of them involve the inability to concentrate, low motivation, preoccupation. And so you might see where some of this is going in terms of neurodivergent grief experiences, because already we're seeing some overlap. So now that we have looked at some common grief experiences for people of all neurotypes, let's take a look at some of the ways that neurodivergent grief can show up differently. So, as I previously alluded to, there can be some overlap in symptoms of grief and features of neurodivergent processing. Grief might, for example, include executive functioning challenges like planning, organization, time management, information gathering. Sometimes this can happen because of, we call it like grief brain. It's kind of a brain fog that sometimes happens to people that are grieving. And so with these executive functioning challenges, for example, somebody that has ADHD, they might be getting a double dose of this while they're grieving. And so that just means that they're going to need extra emphasis on self-compassion at that time, and, having very realistic expectations for themselves. Grief can also intensify our emotions, or it can go the other way and create kind of a numbing effect, even for emotions that aren't necessarily related to the grief itself. Sometimes I have, clients talking about how they notice that they're a lot more irritable, and, emotions are already kind of running high. So it just has this overall intensifying effect or a dampening effect. But for neurodivergent individuals who already can experience their emotions more intensely sometimes, or they might have difficulty connecting and identifying what their emotions are, this can further amplify those experiences. And that heightened emotional state can increase features of impulsivity and impulsive decision making. So there's a very common piece of advice that people give around grieving: not to make any major life decisions in the first year after a death. And that's not going to apply in all cases. Sometimes it might be, the right thing for you. But the reason that it's considered conventional advice is because of how strong emotions can influence us to make decisions or act in ways that we might not otherwise. So it's important to have people around that you trust during this time to help you evaluate those decisions, to, practice mindfulness skills, practicing the pause, all of these things to help manage impulsivity become more important. Also, like any strong emotional experience, grief can impact appetite and sleep. And so we know that many neurodivergent individuals already can struggle with these, having, delayed circadian rhythm, texture issues with food, sensory issues. So already kind of being on a regular cycle with those can, be a challenge at any time. But paying more attention during the grieving process is important. And also normalizing that it's likely that there's going to be fluctuations around this time with sleep and with appetite. So looking at reducing any kind of spoon barriers that there might be, to making sure that you're getting adequate nutrition, doing what you can to get adequate sleep is important. And then lastly, experiencing a death can often come with a lot of practical tasks that have to be done. As you can think, like, particularly if somebody is the executor of a estate, for example, they might be helping out with that. There's a lot of, clerical and kind of hands-on tasks that can come, but this can be even more challenging if you're already experiencing tendencies towards demand avoidance, procrastination, perception of time, organizing, etc. So it's really important to look and make sure that there's sufficient accommodations in place, self-accommodation and external accommodation, in order to counteract that. So commonly we see people who are coping with grief, and you'll ask them, how are you doing with things? How are you coping? And a lot of times they'll say, I'm staying busy. I'm just like keeping really busy. And it's usually really easy to do, to stay busy, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of tasks that accompany grief, particularly in those first 3 months when the emotions are, for a lot of people, at their highest. However, when we over rely on being busy, that can interfere with our need to emotionally process. A little later on, Stephanie's going to talk with you about the dual process model. It's important to have a balance, of both. So it's not recommended that people over rely on staying busy as a coping mechanism. But when we look at neurodivergent grief presentations, sometimes to other people, being in this hyper-focused state might seem like somebody is over relying on staying busy, or that they're disconnecting from their grief through the hyperfocus. But we know that for the neurodivergent person, hyperfixation can actually be extremely regulating, and it can be a protective mechanism in the face of those extreme emotions. I saw this in myself when my grandmother passed away. When she died, I'm a gamer, and I kind of just threw myself into The Sims for probably about just 3 or 4 months straight, and I made little versions of my grandmother and her children in the game, and it was really helpful for me and really regulating for me to have that hyper focus. So hyperfixations might come around somebody's existing or their special interests that they already have, but they could also be on topics that actually have to do with death and grief and loss itself. And so to other people, this might seem morbid, but for many neurodivergent individuals, the information gathering that can come with hyperfixation is really helpful. If you can find the why behind something, if you can find the how behind something, that can bring some comfort in the face of death, which tends to be sometimes kind of this abstract, nebulous concept shrouded in a lot of mystery. So having that information can be really helpful and empowering. We have some resources for you all at the end of the presentation that can be helpful with this. One of the resources that we have actually was given to me by an autistic friend of mine. When her father passed away, she went and found this YouTube channel called Ask a Mortician. And she really found a lot of comfort in this because the channel is all about topics of death and loss and dying, and the practical mechanics of kind of what happens to the body and just various topics around that. And it gave my friend a lot of comfort to know that information. So this access to information, it can be particularly important for neurodivergent children, because a lot of times we see that parents, parents of kids of all neurotypes, they'll try to shield their children from having information about the death or the dying process. They might, not feel that it's appropriate for them to go to the funeral, the viewing, the wake, what have you. And that's a common instinct we see with parents. They don't want to traumatize their child or, overwhelm them, or it might be that they're uncomfortable with answering some of the questions that can come up. But having that information in a way that is developmentally appropriate for the child and their age is more beneficial to them than surrounding it in secrecy and unknowns, or having things come as a surprise later when they're found out. So it's important to not block that tendency, that need to gather information.
And so related to that, and the whole like the how and the why and looking for answers, one thing we see is a really salient part of the neurodivergent experience that is also really relevant with grief is existential concerns. We're often really thinking about like a more intense relationship with meaning making and big questions about mortality. And this can be especially difficult when there are no concrete or clear answers to be had. So it can kind of create an information vacuum. And along with those existential concerns, we think about the ways in which neurodivergent folks may experience more intensely some forms of disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief is a term coined by Kenneth Doka in 1989 to refer to loss that is not openly supported or openly mourned. So, for example, we may experience more grief around transitions and changes and endings, where grief is less socially supported, or the loss of an animal companion. And we also tend to have a heightened justice sensitivity, so focus on social injustice. So things like large-scale tragedy, human rights violations. I'm not sure kind of what experience folks have been having over the last month, but I've had a lot of time processing with clients around violence in Gaza and some of the disingenuous rhetoric around that and how that kind of just hits our brains a little bit differently. And that becomes a form of disenfranchised grief when people around us say like, well, just turn away from the news, right? Just like stop looking at it. And that's like not necessarily how we engage in things. So a couple of other things that we often see, we see increased meltdown and shutdown. Inward shutdown, as we know, is harder to observe by others. So sometimes if someone's experienced a lot of intensity and they've shut down, they may not be able to access some of the same social support if people don't see that they're having that intense internal experience. We also sometimes see opposite reactions, laughing instead of crying. We see scale regression with grieving. And one of the other things, this one's funny, this point about differences in visual working memory. I actually had a client spontaneously bring this up to me yesterday, like in an almost unrelated conversation. And I texted Michelle, like, we didn't think about like the out of sight, out of mind thing. But then we realized it was really salient with a lot of our points. So with ADHD, sometimes differences in visual working memory, if someone is not in front of us, we're not necessarily thinking or talking about them. So some people refer to this as object permanence. That's like not really quite the same thing, but the idea that like without visual cues, sometimes you're not engaging. And so when someone is gone, we may need some cues to like think about or engage about them. Another thing that becomes intensified sometimes is sensory overwhelm. And one of the ways that can show up, we found a blog that like really speaks to this really well. So one of the ways that that sensory overwhelm can show up is this just kind of cognitive feeling of disconnect between things. So this blogger, Carla Fisher, talks about learning about their autism through their experience of grief. And they describe this experience of not being able to put pieces of data together and things just really seeming like disconnected and like having trouble just kind of going from that kind of bottom up to the top down processing. So this is linked in our references if people want to check this blog out.
So let's look at some of the barriers that impact neurodivergent folks in receiving the support that they need when they're grieving, and the ways that neurotypical people might misinterpret neurodivergent needs of grief expression. As with any instance of mixed neurotype communication, the double empathy problem is relevant here, because helping neurodivergent folks access and receive that grief support that they need, or letting them grieve authentically, is not just a challenge for neurodivergent people. Neurotypical people also have a role to play in creating that affirming experience, chiefly by examining their own preconceived notions of what normal grief looks like. If the neurodivergent person is not processing their emotions with that outward display, as Stephanie was talking about, it might be very internal, it might be, shut down. They're having this intense internal process. The outward appearance that, nothing is happening or going on might be misinterpreted, that the death hasn't impacted them in a significant way. Or it might be interpreted that they're not engaging, properly with their grief or their emotions to process it. When in fact, there can be a very intense internal experience going on, and a lot of, processing that isn't obvious to the outside observer. The neurodivergent person might have difficulty communicating this internal experience using words or expected displays of emotion, like crying. Stephanie mentioned the opposite action. There might be that outward manifestation, but it might not be what people are expecting. Like, laughter instead of crying is one example. And so this can lead to a withdrawing or a loss of needed support by others, because they feel like, oh, you're handling it fine. And that can lead the neurodivergent person to feel like they now have to perform grief in order to convey to others how the death is impacting them. And this is a manifestation of masking. So it can create even further drains on energy or feelings of disconnection from that needed support.
So one of the things that we think about as kind of a theme with some of these barriers is that sometimes things that neurodivergent folks are doing can be perceived as sort of a poor coping skill, when actually it is very adaptive. So just kind of thinking about like reframing some of these things, where needing to be alone can be seen as isolating, when really it's potentially destimulating, and that's very adaptive and regulating. It's a regulating strategy. And one of the things Michelle mentioned earlier is like others may see hyperfocus, especially if it's hyperfocus on death, as morbid or poor coping, when actually it is an attempt to resolve an information vacuum. Or it may just be a way of engaging with the loss, which we'll talk about a little bit more with dual process model. And the other thing that we want to consider is that speaking may not be a primary method of communicating. So grief expressions may show up differently: artistic methods, special interests, hyperfocus, stimming, lots of different ways.
So what are some ways to offset these barriers and to support neurodivergent folks when they're grieving? Obviously, with this caveat that everybody's experience is going to be individual. Grief is a highly, highly individualized process. So the very best way to support somebody is to get to know that specific person and their needs. But here's some overall ideas or themes that might be useful. So that first key, again, is just going to be to normalize diverse presentations of grief. It's very common that, people will come in and they'll share what their experience is. And, when I say to them, like, this is normal, like you're not doing it wrong. That in itself is just very relieving. So normalizing diverse presentations, reevaluating the view of what is appropriate or normal grief is a good place to start. And realizing that grief might show up in ways that people are not necessarily expecting it to. Also, it's really key to unlearn the idea that just because someone is grieving in a particular way, it means that they aren't engaging with or processing the death. So rather than focusing on that person's specific grief presentation, shift that focus more to helping them access resources and accommodations that they need, and don't make assumptions when you're exploring their experience. Engaging with people using whichever communication methods are most comfortable for them, and approaching the conversation with curiosity. Secondly, it's important to be mindful of those masking demands that I mentioned, whether that might involve the grief presentation and having to perform grief, as I was saying, or it might be, in fact, masking symptoms, outward symptoms, to appear to be adjusting more quickly to the loss or to resume their normal routines like school or work. So just like we work with people to explore and examine their masking in other contexts, it's important to acknowledge that grief is going to add a unique layer to this. If you think about it, grief for a lot of us means that we're going to be coming into contact with people that we might not frequently see, and people that we might not, know very well might be approaching us about the death. So there's, all those kind of pressures or opportunities for people to feel like they have to mask or perform. And on top of that, the accommodations that we give for grief in society are, just absolute garbage. Like 3 days for bereavement leave is not, it's nowhere near enough. And after a certain preset amount of time, whether it's to get back to work, or, after the first year has passed, people might be expecting us to return to our pre-event self, when the process often takes, far more time and energy. And we know that grief doesn't ever really fully leave us. And we just, grow around it, and we just learn how to carry it. So helping neurodivergent folks unmask, as much as it's safe to do so, can help with these added demands. And another consideration is how common grief rituals can be adapted to reduce sensory or demand overwhelm. So again, if you think about funeral or viewing or wake, just for example, it can mean talking to a lot of people that are often like expecting a certain kind of demeanor from the person who's grieving. Also, there can be a lot of unfamiliar sights, unfamiliar sounds, smells, and in the places where grief rituals are commonly held. And that might add to sensory overwhelm. So one example, I read an account from an autistic woman who was expressing that all of the flower arrangements that were in the room were producing this really strong smell. It was overwhelming to her. So being mindful of any way that you can modify or adapt these situations to reduce that overwhelm can be helpful. And some examples of that might be mentally rehearsing the event before it happens, gathering information about what it might be like, encouraging breaks when needed, staggering or setting limits on the interactions and visitors, visiting hours, working with people who are arranging the ceremonies, like funeral home directors or faith leaders, to find those accommodations and put them into place. And then lastly, something else that can be helpful, and I'm working on this myself, because working in hospice in the South, there's a lot of colloquialisms that come around, with death, and but with neurodivergent experience, it's helpful to be mindful of the language that you're using to describe the death. So using that abstract or indirect language, like "we lost them" or "they passed away," "they're in a better place," that can be confusing or can feel contradicting. So instead, considering using specific and concrete words like "death" and "died," and acknowledging what happens to the physical body after death.
So other things to kind of think about is both in terms of supporting other neurodivergent people through grief, and for ourselves, for those of us who are neurodivergent, is kind of what kinds of accommodations we can offer. So expecting experiences like sensory overwhelm and executive functioning challenges as a normal part of moving through grief. Like grief is truly the most natural thing we do, and like this is going to be part of it if our brains are wired towards these types of things. The other thing I like to think about is adapting and making use of grief theories. Some of them are really salient for neurodivergent folks, and can be kind of used to talk through the neurodivergent grieving experience. So we want to talk a little bit about dual process model of grief and continuing bonds. So dual process model, this is like really one of my favorites. And I use this to apply to a lot of things actually. But the dual process model was developed kind of as a response to the idea of like sort of stages of grief, which was never actually intended to be viewed as stages, but that became kind of part of the popular understanding. But the dual process model says instead, we think of grief as this very dynamic process. And this is kind of naturally a very dynamic process where we move between facing loss and avoiding loss. And so they use the term oscillating, right? So thinking about one of those oscillating fans, like we have on the slide there, if you push a little button down on the fan and you get stuck in one position or the other, you're kind of missing some of the experience that you might need to move through. So if you're stuck in really facing the loss, you can kind of not be able to kind of move forward through like future focused thinking and like continue to make meaning. If you get stuck in avoiding, and I have avoiding in quotes because really this is like naturally part of the process, you're not experiencing your emotions and going through the emotional processing necessary. So this model I think is helpful for neurodivergence, partially because it gives us something really concrete in terms of thinking about how do we help ourselves move from one stage to another or one position to another and continue to oscillate, and also thinking about how these might look different. So this kind of ties back to a lot of what we've talked about through the presentation, but facing loss might look different for a neurodivergent person. For example, it could look more cerebral or cognitive due to interoceptive differences or affective differences. It could look more like the information seeking. Avoiding might look like engaging in special interests, activism, creative expression. So I like to think of things in this category, like around meaning making and future focused thinking as well. And then thinking about, based on your own needs, how do you help yourself move through this? So I think again about like we talked about earlier, the difference in visual working memory. If you get stuck in avoiding because someone is out of sight, out of mind, what kind of cues or visual cues can you create for yourself to make space for your emotional processing? So yeah, I just find that this is really adaptable and like you can really consider what someone's individual kind of profile or neurotype as you consider what these two things might look like and how to move between them. The other one we want to talk about, and both of us want to talk about this because continuing bonds is often like such a powerful way to engage with grief. The idea of continuing bonds is that although death fundamentally changes the relationship with the person who has died, it does not end it. So we think about like maintaining or even creating secure attachment with the person who has died based on the things that we are doing. And because of differences in our nervous systems, secure attachment can look different for us. And so just thinking about that and some of the ways to maintain or create those bonds. So engaging in shared special interests, like an example from my personal life is my grandfather was crossword puzzle fanatic, and he just had like a wild, gigantic silly vocabulary. Like he just knew so many words. And so even now, so many years after he's died, when I see a really interesting vocabulary word, I always think about him, and I always wonder if like that was in his list, and really take interest and take note of those things, which feels like a continuing bond. It can look like talking to or about the deceased. It can look at, it can be like you can draw on this by creating those cues to engage due to memory differences. Yeah, and Michelle, I know you've seen some really good examples of this too.
Yeah, I use this theory a lot with clients because it can really dovetail nicely when people are really at all phases, but with this meaning making process. So, some more examples of continuing bonds might look like eating or making somebody's favorite foods, wearing their clothes, wearing their jewelry, or keeping items that belong to them, on your person, in your pocket, on a necklace, what have you. Creating a special area in the home for pictures and mementos. I have this. I have a special bookshelf where I have pictures of my dog Lily and her urn, also pictures of my dad. And when I'm, engaging with that and spending time in that area, it really helps me feel close to their presence. This is another one I think that sometimes is like not as well understood because people will look at that and say like, oh, you're making a shrine, like you should, it's been long enough. But no, this can be a really helpful to have like a space to locate. So engaging in shared activities or interest. Stephanie mentioned the crossword puzzles. I love that example. Incorporating somebody's memory into your daily rituals or periodic rituals like holidays. Or it can also be volunteering or donating to a charity in their honor. And those are just some examples. They're going to be very individual, but it's ways to actively engage with their memory and feel, near to their presence.
Michelle, I'm not sure if there are things you want to say about the resources and the references that are in our slides, but we are going to make sure our slides go out to everybody. We have a number of resources, and Michelle, feel free to send me back in the slides too. The Ask a Mortician YouTube channel that Michelle mentioned. And then we also have our references just for things that we kind of talked about throughout the presentation. So we'll make sure that folks have this. Michelle, is there other stuff you wanted to say about the resources or references?
Just that we just try to kind of include some general ones that may be helpful. I have a lot of resources. I kind of hoard resources. So if there's any like particular area that you're interested in some resources around, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to share what I have with you. But these are just kind of a starting place.
Yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing so that we can maybe look at some of the stuff in the chat and kind of just like see if folks want to share a little bit of what they reflected on. So let's see.
Yeah, Bobby Joe was sharing about
Yes, the
the
out of sight, out of
sight.
mind.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, oh, I love that consideration too, that like you temporarily forget about it and then get that like wave and then the shame and guilt with that when it's like truly such a normal thing. Oh, and I like Marie's point here about relationship degradation. Like, it's sort of those, like, I guess the way we see that in day to day is like those friendships where we don't talk to somebody for like months and years at a time. And it's like no time has passed. You don't think of that relationship any differently. Neurotypicals may have more check-in with survivors. They're thinking about it. Yeah, we can lose our community in that grieving process. And Bobby Joe mentions, yeah, losing someone, even if you're not super close, bringing up additional grief around the parts of us that are holding pain about not having the kinds of connections, because it can be so difficult for us to find our people. Marie mentions suicide being more common in our community, and like a particular grief of our connections dying by suicide and the structures in our society that make us feel powerless. And a question from Moira about ND secure attachment. Yeah, I can send out Dr. Neff is a good, it's like Neurodivergent Insights. Dr. Neff has a lot of research about kind of differences in nervous system with autistic and ADHD folks. And there's some research out there that suggests that if you are particularly have like high sensory sensitivities, that can affect your attachment. Because just think about like even as a young child having high sensory sensitivity, sometimes connection can feel overwhelming if there's not like attunement. And then Megan also has a question about how facing grief can look more cerebral or cognitive due to interoceptive differences. So yeah, this is sort of, and there's actually lots of reasons it can look more cerebral or cognitive, and it doesn't for everybody. Like, you know, we all present differently. But if you have sort of a like disconnect from, so interoceptive differences, sorry, I'm like looking at everything in the chat at once. So sometimes that is about like our internal cues, like thirst and hunger, but it can also just be about like kind of our body cues around our emotions. And so if you have trouble accessing that, you may be better able to kind of talk about your experience just in a more like cognitive way. So that's where that can sometimes look a little bit different.
Yeah, and I think that a really important piece of that is that idea of engaging with emotional topics in a more thought-based way, cognitive, way. It can be looked at again as, oh, you're not engaging properly with this, like you're not letting yourself feel it. When in fact, working through something from a cognitive stance can be really helpful to a lot of indie folks. So not rushing to this assumption that, you're intellectualizing this experience. And so therefore, you're not really going to heal from it. You really kind of have to look at, how is this impacting somebody, their functioning, their meaning making abilities, that kind of thing. Look more broadly at just, are they crying, or are they like sitting in the actual sensation of the emotion? It's not as simple as that. Also, I wanted to say around the points, those are amazing points that everybody is putting in the chat. Absolutely love that. The point that Bobby Joe made around how losing somebody, even if you don't have this super close, outward relationship with them, bringing up a lot of pain about just connections in general and just how we, process losing connections. And then also Marie's point about suicide. Those are two really great examples of disenfranchised grief. So, with suicide, there can be stigma and there can be, shame around that. And it can bring up, more complicated feelings about the deceased person, or contradictory feelings, so it can be anger and all these things. So because of that, because it doesn't fit in this nice little neat, box again that we kind of have in our mind for what does grief look like, it can end up getting disenfranchised because that person might not be able to process it with others in a way that they might be expecting. And then to Bobby Joe's point, how much grief you're supposed to feel is, again, just there's so many assumptions around it. So, pets, people that we weren't particularly close to, anytime that somebody might look at that and say, why are you so upset about this? Why are you so attached to this? That's disenfranchised grief. And, that's that shaming that can come from that. So great points.
Evie, I see you have a hand raised. I would say anybody who wants to jump in and has stuff to add, like, please feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. Evie, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you both so much for bringing this topic to us today. I think grief, especially in our community, well, I mean, like you both have said today, is really complicated and often just looks so different. And I appreciate how you touched on, Michelle, like collecting items that have maybe meaning for the person that we've lost. Because, so often I think for us, the intentionality we have with objects, like transitional objects, how we like to organize our objects, has so much meaning for us. And it makes me think of when I first experienced loss as a child when we had to put my cat down. I collected his food bowls, all of his wet canned food that we hadn't used, and I put it all in my room and just had it all lined up. And I kind of almost went through the routines, like ghost routines of like, oh, we fed him at this time of the day. And, so like continuing to honor those routines, I think is another way that our community may like process grief. So if we're not doing it in this very like externally emotional way, it's that very internal, intentional process. So I really appreciated you bringing that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think that's a great point. I don't know how the people around you responded to that. Hopefully they were supportive, but that's a great example of how other people might look at that and say, oh, you're holding on. Like you need to be able to let go. When in fact that collecting, that having close, that reminding yourself of the routines is a way that you are moving through that grief. And without that, to have those things just kind of like ripped away, it might not have been, as smooth of a transition. So thank you for sharing that. And my heart just goes out to little you and loss of your cat. I love that. That's a precious story.
Brett, definitely just jump in.
Hi, I'm Britt. A couple of comments I want to make. First of all, really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom with our community. It was a couple of comments. One, I feel like a lot of the things that we are thinking about for neurodivergent people would just be great for like everybody, just like that, like individualized, like what do you need, and like that is so universal. And I like even just validating that is really cool. But the other thing I was kind of thinking about, and this is shifting a little bit but maybe not, just when I have clients who go through a breakup, right? And like it's very similar. Obviously you're losing a breakup, right? Even if the person's still alive, there is that sense of grief. And like a lot of neurodivergent people are like, how am I supposed to be reacting in this breakup, right? How am I supposed to feel? People will say like, just move on, like, forget about it. And like, it's just a kind of reminder of how everyone deals with things differently. But like when you give someone kind of that benefit of the doubt for like death and like loss, how important it could be for our clients to tell them there's no right or wrong way to grieve this loss of this relationship, and it can last however long it needs to last.
Yeah, and like really, like breakups, we often would categorize that as disenfranchised grief. And especially with, and I know we didn't go too far into it, but Gabriella, thank you for recommending the post about attachment theory for neurodivergent folks. Like, that is something that can also change the way that we go through breakups and experience the disenfranchised grief of that.
Yeah, Britt, you make a great point there.
Yeah.
Grief is more than just death, right? And this presentation, you were really trying to like hone in on the neurodivergent experience, which of course is going to be so broad too. But there's so much that I could say about grief. Like I could sit here and talk to you about it forever. But that's a like wonderful point. Grief is not just death. It can really be around like transitions and changes. And, for a lot of neurodivergent people, change is extremely unsettling. So divorce, changing a job, even positive things we experience a grief with sometimes. We might be like leaving a job to go to one that's a better fit for us, for example, but there still can be grief in what you're leaving behind, and the parts of you that it shaped. So absolutely we should be applying these same principles to all types of transitions. There's grief in that. And you're absolutely right. This message of how is it for you is such an important message for anybody of any neurotype. thank you guys for engaging with us. I really appreciate all
Yes.
the questions and comments. It's really special for me to see people thinking and talking about this topic because, you know, there is such a aversion, I feel like, to, you know, to thinking about this in times when it's not happening. So yeah, thanks everybody for engaging.
Yeah, like when Michelle and I kind of first started discussing like neurodivergence as a lens for grief, because these were kind of some shared clinical interests, we realized just like how much we could have like tried to cover here, and there's so much. So I think both of us would be happy to continue these conversations with people if you want to reach out to us.
100%.